And then very quickly, Senate inatengeneza bill. I've heard Honorable Ndisho talk about a consortium of church leaders heading to the court. And I also want to underscore what I inferred as a question from Redemptor. We're talking about 400 people killed. While all this back and forth is happening, who is working for the justice of those people? Because this is not theoretical. For anybody who has lost their lives, there's a family agonizing somewhere. And so, we know that there were failures, even as we are talking about regulation or lack thereof. Where is justice for those who were harmed? And it doesn't matter whether they were harmed through religion or otherwise, they were harmed, and they deserve justice. So even as we have this conversation, I hope that we don't lose sight of that. Asante Wallace.
Thank you, Mzalendo.
Thank you, Wallace, for the excellent moderation. And thank you, Wakili Charles Kanjama, for really giving your time and being here the whole more than 3 hours. We really appreciate that. I really feel like we have taken a lot of your time and we had not prepared you about the extension. So you have been very gracious to us. We appreciate your time. And also, Bishop, we thank you for your comments. We thank you, Professor Kivutha, and everyone who has made their comments today. I feel, okay, at first I felt like there is a conflict between the work of the task force and what Bishop is proposing, but I almost feel like we could get to a middle ground. And what I feel from the sharing by Senior Counsel Charles Kanjama is that they considered a lot of factors and they did a thorough job. And I also feel they really have the good intentions. So I hope that there'll be a meeting of minds. I don't know much about the Mungatana bill, and maybe that is not what we were discussing today, but the task force report and what Bishop is recommending, there could be a middle ground. And I hope that we have more opportunity to discuss, because we also don't want to extend forever. We know we have kept you already. So we don't want to extend beyond this time. I hope that we have another chance to interrogate even further. I hope we can hear more from the bishop, what they are proposing, because there seems to be a group around that of clergymen. What are they proposing about self-regulation, and what is the way forward? How can we find a middle ground? So thank you very much. I really appreciate everyone who has been part of this conversation. I will be consulting our speaker and our co-hosts so that we see if we continue with this conversation maybe next week. We could have the same topic or maybe vary the topic. Maybe we could have other speakers. I have seen somebody recommending that we invite an imam. That's something we can also look at, because this is a very important conversation right now in this country. And it's good to strike when the iron is hot. So thank you so much. Mbarikiwe nyote. If you have a comment, a suggestion, I always request you to come to the inbox. I saw somebody asking for the task force report, another person asking for the bill. Please, if you share your contacts on the chat section, not chat or my inbox or inbox of the co-hosts, we will share those reports. So thank you very much. Back to you, Wallace, for the final. So I don't know, just before that, I don't know if our speaker has a final comment before we end. Mr. Kanjama.
Okay, so maybe I can make a final comment now that you've requested. I think I've spoken for long. And I would like to thank everyone who has participated in this space, those who've organized it, the hosts, the speakers, the listeners, those who've contributed with questions, with comments. I would like to encourage all of us to continue engaging on these matters. Read the task force report, send comments. Hopefully the implementation committee will be set up soon. And for those who would like to take further action, for example, against the Mungatana bill, like Bishop Dichu, go ahead, because definitely you cannot organize something for the church without the church or in opposition to the interests of the church. And I'm hoping that as a result of the activity that has started, it was, yes, triggered by a crisis, that the church will be stronger, the religious sector will be stronger. And ultimately, the religious sector exists so that each of us, especially adults, formed, can seek and find the truth, can seek an encounter with God, a supernatural world. The policy document, the draft policy of the task force has discussed and described some of these concepts associated with religion. And we have been built, we have been designed so that we can seek God and find Him. And by finding and engaging with God, we can learn better to engage with our fellow men and women. And hopefully men and women of faith, people of religion, will be the light that has been lit and set on the table, or the city built on a hilltop that can illuminate all and be sources of good example. Even as we discuss religion from the corporate perspective, there is a call for each of us to examine and reflect on our own individual approach to religion, a personal relationship with God. It's how it impacts our personal behavior and our social engagements with others. And when we have men and women who champion true religion and faith, they will be able to drown evil in an abundance of good.
Thank you.
Thank you once
very much.
again, Senior Counsel. So once again, as we conclude, just to remind us that we have these sessions every Tuesday and Friday from 7:30 p.m. So please keep checking, because we'll be announcing the next space and the topic. Wallace.
Tunaingia vijijini, mijini na hata jijini kukuletea taarifa mchana kutwa. Usiku tunakaa kitako, tunadadavua tukichanganua taarifa na makala muhimu yanayokuhusu wewe na familia yako.
Nasikia watu wanasema baba ametusaliti. Between baba kutusaliti na sisi kusaliti baba, nani amesaliti mwingine?
Inapeangwa, it mostly goes to foreign ministries. So Baba is overqualified for that position.
To build this railways for Africa. So now he's thinking about tumemkataa kama baba wetu.
Unaweza kuwa kuna mtoto ulizaa, ukapatia nchi, ikuwe inamfanya vile inataka.
Uhuru has been working very hard. Ruto akaenda huko na nguvu. Ruto was never invited in the inauguration.
Ungana na Bernard Ngozi kwenye Open Forum Political Show kuanzia saa 4 usiku hadi dakika zake kila siku ya wiki kwenye Soundcard Talk.
Open Forum Political Discussion Show the show that gives you an opportunity to air what you feel and think about the latest development.
Tukutane Sound Candy Talk.
Naikara, Shangoe, Ilimatuok, Loita, Emruadikiri, Kiligoris, Olulunga, Narok is watching. Unatazama Sound Candy Talk. Toa sauti yako usikike. Watch, share, like, subscribe.
And I am not going to mince my words. The truth of the matter is the world needs Africa. Africa does not need the world. We have everything we need on earth. We could paralyze the world economies. Take a simple thing. Like we decide DRC can no longer export its coltan. That alone can paralyze the world.
Been much better because the fact that Kenya is such a,
or maybe
For me, when it comes to regulation of churches, the key thing is regulate what? The how. The how is a very critical component of regulating churches. Now, let's assume Rwanda has done something like that. But if you look at the church itself, are you going to regulate and say, okay, I want the bishop to have PhD, the pastor to have masters, or maybe the leader to have a
let's say a diploma or what? Is it that I want to regulate how they collect their tithes and offering? What is about to be regulated of these churches? I think before we can dwell with that, we should know. But because for me, I think these are very sensitive issues. You see, on what I believe. We have different denomination. Like myself, I'm an Anglican. Maybe there are some, and Catholic Church is a church. Maybe there are some things they do I don't believe with. There are some things maybe like PCA they do I don't believe with. So we must be very clear on what are we regulating in these churches. I think regulate is a very broad word.
Oh, okay. Gentleman Pole, I've been having a bit of a challenge, but I'm on. Let me maybe help clarify that bit, even as we wait for our guest to, or is he back? I don't see him on the panel, but I can maybe clarify this. What happened is there was, of course, I'm sure Jamhuri has given you a brief that after the Shakahola, there was a task force that was immediately set up, and its mandate was to identify gaps in the legal and governance frameworks of religious, listen, it was for regulation of religious organizations. So it was for all, not just for the church, but since we fall in there, that is how this discussion came to be. And considering also our guest is the chair actually of the Kenya Christian Professionals Forum. So since he's a member of that task force, we figured he's one of the right people to come and further clarify it for us. But the mandate was to identify those gaps in the legal and governance frameworks that had allowed an extremist organization like the one at Chakahola, and to propose things that bring measures to prevent future abuses. Now, the things that they had come up with, I'll give you the framework. My belief is, of course, our key guest will expound on them. The first one was they wanted to do re-registration of religious organizations, of which in this case, of course, it will be applying to churches. All religious organizations were supposed to undergo a vetting process to ensure they meet ethical and legal standards. I know in Rwanda was very extreme. I think they even said they want to do building structure reassessment, some radical stuff like that, and degrees. Then that was number one, re-registration of all religious organizations. Number two, creation of a religious affairs commission, which he will expound. But this body was supposed to consist, let's say, of government and religious representatives who would oversee religious groups and ensure compliance with the law. So they envisioned to work alongside umbrella organizations like the NCCK and, of course, EAK and those kind of organizations. Then they want to implement a new legal framework. What they mean by legal framework is they want to draft specific laws for religious organizations, clarifying crimes that could be committed under the guise of religion, and ensuring proper registration and legal recognition of religious entities. Then they want also to look into the regulation of religious media, which means Hope TV, those kind of Hope Radio. So the idea would be amendments to the Kenya Information and Communication Act that are proposed to better regulate what we see on TV as far as TVs and stations that belong to media, to churches and religious organizations, and maybe even the programming or radio, okay? So that to curb the promotion of harmful ideologies. Then finally, the fifth one was something like education reforms, suggesting the incorporating of teachings of non-extreme ideologies in faith in schools. And pretty much when Ruto was given the report, he was like emphasizing that the goal of the government is to protect the freedom of worship while ensuring that such freedoms are not misused to harm citizens. And so it's really their goal, as I said, was to strike a balance between religious freedom and public safety. I hope that gives a clear outline of what they were out to do. And the desire was now for our guest to come and give the more thorough details, and we can query the same. So ideally, it was also for us, after we hear his explanation or when he's here, we can also give our views on, after having that draft in mind, to give our feedback. Do we believe that the church in these 5 areas that I've mentioned and in any other areas really need to be regulated? Oh, good to see council is here. So, and he will expound on that. And then for sure, we can agree as people that something needs to be done in church. There's been a lot of incidents. We know Shakahola was extreme. When it gets to a place where we are looking at over 400 people dead, that is an extreme of religious abuse. So we understand maybe why there was a reaction, and we know also there are many things we've been watching on television. There are many things about church that have not been pleasant, but the question is, what things do we feel maybe should be regulated? And if they are to be regulated, do we want them regulated by government, or which aspects should be regulated by government? Like now, once we've spoken about TV, what goes on TV content for Christian or religious, that's considered religious programming. But the first person we wanted to give the opportunity, of course, to expound on it would be our chief guest. But it would have been good, of course, for we want the participants to also first give an outline. If you, now that you have a rough idea of what the discussion is about, what are your thoughts? I believe, Maura, you are very keen on making sure you've understood exactly what was this task force was about, and what are your initial thoughts on that. Then when we hand it over to our chief guest, he'll be able to explain maybe point by point, this is what we have been thinking, and we are able to have an engaging conversation from that dimension. And we would like to remind, of course, all our participants, we had an interesting talk on Tuesday that our guest is the messenger, is carrying the messenger. Don't shoot the messenger. The idea is, as Jamhuri has suggested, we need to know if we are disagreeing with something, we disagree with it agreeably. It is not his idea, it is what the task force is coming up with. This is a form of almost public participation. We're engaging in public participation. He's going to hear our feedback, and that will be very fruitful for the conversation. So maybe we start by saying on your initial thoughts as participants, even as our chief guest prepares himself, on when you hear those 5 areas. I've just mentioned them to you. Let me repeat them for you so that you get it. That number 1, they want to do re-registration of religious organizations, and in this case, churches. Okay. Number 2, these are now recommendations. Creation of a religious affairs commission. Okay. He'll explain the deeper on that. Number 2, a new legal framework so that we can clarify which crimes, what will be defined as a crime under the guise of religion. So, for example, will those potassium permanganate things end up there? Those things where you manipulate people to get money. And then number 3, regulation of media, that is religious media. And finally, education reforms, which will be expounded. So I think now you have a rough idea. We can open out the floor to people to chip in their 2 cents at the moment, before as we plan to give chief guests to start expounding deeper. I hope that is clear. Would you like to start, maybe even JN, our host, your thoughts?
Thank you, Wallace, for the opportunity. And thanks everyone who has joined. We are really happy to have this session. And again, my apologies for the space that dropped. My internet got a problem, and so I could not act fast enough. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm glad to see our speaker, and I'm glad to see all those on the panel. I'm glad to see Professor Kivutha Kibwana. I know we had this conversation, and he said, why don't we discuss this? And it was a great idea that we have this conversation. So we really appreciate that. Professor is always with us. He is always joining us for these sessions, and we appreciate his presence. So should the state regulate churches? This is a I know this is a very hot debate, the issue of regulation, because the church is, there are many in the church who may fear or are careful about tyranny that the state may try to impose against the church, and they feel that this might really work against the church. So there are people who feel the church should be given a chance to regulate itself, both the clergy and also for us who are Christians. There are some of us who feel let the church be allowed, or the church should act fast enough and come up with a way of regulating itself. But on the other hand, there is those extremes. If I may mention the Kanyaris of this world and the Shakahola, that Mackenzie, they definitely need to be regulated for one reason or the other. So I think there is need to, this is just my opinion, there is need to strike a balance so that those people, we know there are people who really don't even represent the Christian faith. They don't have the character. Their actions are not biblical. They are outrightly manipulating faithfuls, or they are taking advantage of people and using Christianity to rob people, to enslave them. So they need to be controlled. So the question here is, should the state be the one to regulate this kind of extreme behavior, or should the church take the opportunity and organize themselves and bring about the regulation? But I also know in that there is also the fear of tyranny by the bigger churches or the mainstream churches against the smaller churches. So for me, I am here to listen, and I know there are people who hold different opinions, who are much better informed than myself, like the speaker and others who I can see in the meeting. I look forward to getting the clarity from both sides, and then we see where we go. But anyway, thank you so much. I have spoken more than I should. I am here to listen more. Thank you. God bless you. I look forward to a great conversation.
Thank you, Jan. I get your sentiment. Yeah, in fact, we want to know, yes, that can a balance be struck where whatever the church cannot regulate, that maybe might need jailing, because we do not jail people. Maybe that there's a bit where we might self-regulate, and then maybe present the ones who are extreme for government to finalize. But yeah, we can take a few more comments before we give our chief guest. We'll not keep him waiting too long, because the better he explains it, the better we'll be able to understand. But we know people have had experiences with extremities in church, even if it's not extreme to the level of getting suicidal like Shakahola. We've had cases of things that we really felt something like this needs to be regulated, even if it's to be self-regulated. There's just stuff in church that has been out of hand. So we'll give a few more people an opportunity to give their input in that direction, maybe 2 or 3. Then we will request our guest to further expound on what the task force has been about and his engagement, and to now go a bit deeper into exactly what was being proposed, and even some of his personal reflections on the pros and cons, because now he would be our expert on this would help us as a church in this way, or maybe even this one I might not personally agree with it because he has his personal opinions. So when it comes to the same ideas, now Brother Maura, would you be able to give a comment in the same direction?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and now since now here we are taking Shakahola as an example. From what I fully believe, I might be wrong, I might be right, that there is no way we can have all those massacres happening in Shakahola without the knowledge of the state. I fully believe the state was fully aware of what was taking place in Shakahola. But that's beside the point today. But we are talking about. I believe that the authority knew, Kenya authority knew, and state knew what was happening. There's no way you can kill, bury all those hundreds of people without the state knowing. No, I don't believe in that. Now, number two, when we talk of regulating the church, we should first of all find out who the church is from, and then we can now go from there. What regulation can be made? But since I've heard about your five issues, I'm very happy with the number 3, the legal framework of what can consist of a church. This time has changed. Before, when the church started, it was houses. People were going in houses and praying from there. But now things have changed. Now we need the buildings and this and this. This one, number 3, legal framework, for me, I fully support it. But the number 3, the rest on the education, what kind of education given by who and to whom? That one, and also registration is very important, so that we don't have mushrooming things of of people coming up with houses and calling themselves churches and this and this and this. So registration is also very important, so that if anything wrong happens, we can know. Now, if Shakahola was registered and this, you could know who registered it, where, how, who was knowing that what was happening there. We could have known that. Although to finalize, I say that I fully believe that the state was fully aware of what was happening in Shakahola. Let me stop there, and so that I can listen to our guests, and then from there now we can debate on what is about to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. I agree with you. Yes, that's the clarity we'll be seeking. So even, for example, with the re-registration and the vetting, we'll get a better understanding of maybe what criteria they will use. And remember, these are spiritual things, spiritual matters. Is it they look at the doctor? What will they do? But we'll get more clarity from our chief guest. So I'm sure he's taking note. So I would ask maybe Wanjiro to make a comment, and then we can see from that. Wanjiro, karibu, if you're ready.
Asante. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Jay and Jamhuri Waris, and the guest. It's Wanjiro, and I want to make my comment. I think just echoing on the 5 points which you said, the church needs to be regulated. I mean, I don't even understand how we never regulated the church from 1963. That's where we all went wrong. If we all started in 1963 to regulate the church, things would have been much better, because the fact that Kenya is such a multi-denominational church, Kenya has the freedom of worship. I do believe all of them should be not only regulated, should be on the legal framework, should be registered. We should have pastors who have went to theology school. See here, you just wake up and say, Roho Mtakatifu ameniongelesha. No, we should have people who are professionals in this field. Of course, there will be people who will be lying like Shakahola, but if you have professionals, who are pastors, who are priests, who are just like the Catholic Church, it's very rare for them to find anyone who have not went to theology going to stand on the pulpit to preach. I think where we went wrong is these other churches. I'm so sorry if you go to other churches, where you find out there is no teachings whatsoever. Someone can just wake up and say, God has talked to me. Yes, God has talked to you, but the state should say, if God has talked to you and you want to open your own church, go and study. Come and show us you have a certificate in theology. Go show us you have a certificate in this. This is how you make sure you don't have people who are not professionals doing this thing, and I just make also that point of we need professionals doing the preaching. Because you find out like our mothers are being lied to, like kuja ulipe 310, you find the 310 pastor is just doing it for himself. Hajaenda shule, and how do you start delivering people with just, I mean, I do believe God speaks to people, but at the same time, even if God is speaking to you, just go and show yourself. There is reason we have schools. There is reasons a doctor doesn't wake up in the morning and say, I want to start. You don't just wake up in the morning and say, I want to start now healing people or start giving medicine if you don't have a certificate. You can't just wake up and say, I'm building a road if you are not an engineer. That's the same thing that should be in the churches. You can't just wake up one morning and start preaching on the streets if you're not a professional to do that. We need to start sensitizing. You don't have to maybe have good grades or whatever, to become a priest, but you should have gone at least for theology trainings. You should have gone for civic training. You should have gone for psychological training. These are the certain types of training that a pastor I believe, should have. But hii maneno unapata Kanyari is doing or Chakahora is doing without having proper psychological training. Okay. So sorry. So I am I'm actually eager to hear what the guest has to say and everyone else, and we'll be making our final submission. Thank you. I finished.
Thank
Okay,
you,
thank you. Sorry, my mic was playing a bit. Thank you for that. Then we'll maybe take one more. I can ask Anthony to give his submission, and then we will invite our guest. Anthony, welcome. Are you there, Anthony? Anthony. Okay, if Anthony is not there, I'll ask data activist to give his comment, and then data activist, you can give your comment, and then I will invite the chief guest to proceed.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. My contribution is on the 5 frameworks. Is there, in that framework, I didn't hear the regulation of the location of the churches. You find in residential areas, in a radius of 3 kilometers, there can be 10 churches. That's one. Number two, the operation of those churches, what times? Because sometimes you'll be awoken not by the melodious sounds that emanates from these proposed churches, but the racketing. It's like they're performing an exorcism in a very loud manner. Yeah. So those are my concerns, because these churches are regulated. They have specific areas. The same way bars are regulated, they have specific times, specific areas. Yeah. So that is my concern, because I mean, with them mushrooming everywhere, it's basically disturbing the peace. So,
okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, data
I didn't
activist.
hear that in the framework. Yeah,
Oh,
thank
are
you.
you? Okay, thank you very much. Of course, sorry, it would behoove us not to get Jamhuri's point of view. Wanjiro, kindly mute your mic. We're getting a bit of an echo. I can see your mic is still on. Thank you. So, Jamhuri, did you have any thoughts in the same direction?
Yeah, so I want to point the kind of the elephant in the room, right? Ndovu wako hapa leo? Hayuko hapa. The elephant in the room being that I think there's this notion that church is currently unregulated, completely unregulated, and that's perhaps something that Wakili can help us think through, right? Because to the degree that we are all under the Constitution, we are all regulated by something. Church, one of the points there was about re-registration, and if it's a re-registration, it means that churches currently do register, and so they are within some sort of framework right now. So, what are the weak points of that framework, right? So I think I'm just saying that so that we don't have this false dichotomy of regulated versus unregulated, because in reality, and I stand corrected, if I'm getting this wrong, currently everybody is regulated one way or the other. If you act fraudulently, if you kill, if you break the law, whether you're doing that in the name of the church, in the name of your family, in the name of JN Karaoke, who is the host of this space, you would be held responsible for that. And so, and I'll take even the example of someone disturbing the peace. Are there rules against that? Whether you're doing that in the name of the church or in the name of anybody else, is it a church issue, or is it the fact that you're disturbing the peace that is the problem? Then there's of course the emotive question of whether people should go to theology school in order to practice leadership in religion. And Wanjiro is saying kila mtu asome, hakuna kukuja hapa kukua kwak. And I'm sure there will be people who have different views about that, right? Because who knows? What if we say that to host an X-Space, you need to have a certificate in IT? You know, and is that a false equivalent? I don't know, right? But I'm just saying, I'm just laying this to say that I recognize that there is a multiplicity of views, some strongly held, some not so strongly held, and that is okay, right? There's the question of freedom of conscience. Who am I to tell you what to believe? If you believe that if you give 310, you will be blessed, someone lied to you and you believed in it, am I infringing upon your rights to tell you that you should not believe that? You know, I don't know. Is that fraud? Is it not fraud? If it's fraud, are there laws against fraudulent activities? So again, I'm just laying this out on the table to say it is okay if you have these contradictory questions in your head. There's nothing simple about this conversation, so we will not oversimplify it. It is a complex matter, and that complexity is why we're having this conversation.
Thank you. Indeed, Jamhuri, you're on point. Actually, even scripturally, one of the things that people noted about people like Peter was that they were uneducated. And the idea is there's those dimensions that we need to consider, that when it comes to spiritual matters, it's not always the school you've gone to. The question is, are you still a person of integrity? Are you truly a disciple of Christ? So, and now those are the things that we are saying. Can government be the one to regulate and tell you you are not a Christian enough preacher? Your message is not doctrinally sound. Are they the one to do that, or isn't it supposed to be the church? And now that's why this is very important. I can see, Anthony is back. He's raised his hand. Kindly, Anthony will be the last one for now before the guest speaks. Anthony?
Thank you, Ole. Sorry, I'm still working. I was doing something. So there's a mic that is on because I can hear myself. Okay. When we ask the question, should churches be regulated? The question is, why is that question coming up? It's because we've seen people abuse the freedom that the state had given to religious sects to actually self-regulate themselves with very little regulation from government. And more so when it comes to us, to the Christians. You've not had a lot of extremes from the Islam and the Hindus. And maybe it's because they are not they're in the minority, so we really don't look into them much, but we've not had it. Should there be regulations? I believe yes, because when we have regulations, it actually protects the good and keeps away the bad. Now, we've had a lot of bad people come into the religious circles, and I repeat again, especially on terms of those of us who are believers of Christ and we follow the Christianity way of religion. Now, what has this? The net effect of this is that one, it is making Kenyans every day lose the confidence they have in our religious bodies, and this should have been curtailed early on if churches got into the point of saying, for us who have gone to theology, for the Catholics and the Presbyterians, the PCAs and the ACKs, when they saw something wrong, like I will not go into the 3310s and the Shakaholas, but they should have been able to sit down and call it out and say, according to us, and we all read the same book, what you're doing is not correct, and what you're preaching is not what is set out or is not factual. They should have been fact-checking themselves. Now, because that did not happen, the work of the state is to protect all its citizens. Now, this is where people are asking, and this is one of the few things where Kenyans actually asked the state to come in and regulate the church. It's after we've seen, not only Shakahola, this is almost like the second time that this is happening. But to land, I'm going to say the functions of the state is to protect its citizens. And I wish that the church would have regulated itself by calling out the wrongs when they saw them happen. The fact that they went to mute was where the rain started beating them. And they are now forcing the state to come up with a prescribed set of rules that now they have to fall under. Churches, religious is not bad. It's the doctrine, it's what is taught that spoils the congregation. Now, the biggest question will be, will government be able to give almost, it's almost like they want to make the church be like a school. So the church will have a syllabus that when you come to Exodus, this is what you should teach in terms of Exodus chapter 1, Genesis chapter. Now, that will be the tricky part, because the Bible is open to interpretation. So even if you try to question someone, they'll tell
Anthony,
you,
I hope you are almost landing.
Yeah, I'm interpreting it according to me. No, so it's how well we shall go into saying, how do we interpret the scripture so that it is not weaponized against people and used as a tool to enrich or also to do money laundering. Now, those are the questions we shall be looking at. For me, I feel that should be looked at.
Thank you. I think now we can ask our guests to, we'll give our guests the opportunity to answer most of these questions that we've already brought to the fore, as he explains what the task force was about, and we give him ample time to go through it. So karibu sana Senior Counsel, welcome, the mic is yours and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wallace. It is such a pleasure to be in this forum that is to discuss the question of regulation of churches. And there have been already very insightful contributions and comments and also questions. So let me start by introducing myself. My name is Charles Kanjama, as you've been told. First, I am a lawyer, an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. Second, I practice in a law firm called Muma and Kanjama Advocates. That's my day job. Thirdly, I currently serve as the chair of an organization called Kenya Christian Professionals Forum that brings together Christian professionals to advocate on matters of life, family, religious freedom, values-based education, and good governance. And then finally, last year, after the President William Ruto saw what had happened at Shakahola, and in response to the concern of many Kenyans, he established a presidential task force to look at religious organizations in Kenya. And I was appointed as one of the members of this task force We were given a job to do within 3 months. And after asking for an extension and being given an extension, we took an additional 3 months. So in 6 months, we studied the question of regulation of religious organizations. So the first point I'd like to make is that even though the topic today is should the state regulate churches, for the Presidential Task Force, we were clear that we should deal with all religions, that is the main religions, whether Christian, Muslim, Hindu, in the same way, because our constitution does not permit us to favor one religion over another or discourage one over another. So we were focusing on regulation of religious organizations. So even though the question has been focusing on churches, we were asking ourselves, what is the level of regulation of mosques, churches, temples, and other religious organizations? The second thing I think that is useful to say is that because Shakahola is something that struck at the conscience of the nation, we were all appalled by what happened there. There were many people who are concerned. Why did this happen? And many people have done investigations into what led to Shakahola and also what kind of recommendations to give. There were investigations by the judiciary, very rapid, about how come they did not take up more effectively the cases that were filed against Mackenzie there in Malindi, because he was released on bond on 2 or 3 occasions in different cases. They issued a 4-page statement. Some of us read it at the time, several months ago. The police, the DPP, they've all done their own investigations. In addition to those investigations by the various agencies, the Malindi Pastors Fellowship, which includes religious leaders who are there in the area, not exactly in Shakahola, but in Malindi, because Shakahola is not so far from Malindi. They've also done their own reflections, and we spoke to them as members of the Presidential Task Force. Most importantly, 3 organs of the state. One is the Senate, also established an ad hoc committee to investigate Shakahola, and it was chaired by Danson Mungatana, and they did a quick job in 3 months. They investigated, they received memoranda on what may have caused Shakahola, what may have led to Shakahola, and what may be ailing the religious sector. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, from the human rights angle, also did a report of their own on what they thought was the problem with Shakahola. And because the president is allowed in law to establish a task force, he established the task force, and that was the 3rd agency that did the most exhaustive work. As the task force, we went around the country. We were 19 members, including representatives from various religious organizations. There were Muslims, Christians, Hindu there, and also people representing other sectors of society. And for the Christians, you had evangelicals, Protestants, and Catholics there. You had lawyers, you had other professionals. And we split ourselves into 3 groups and visited each of the 47 counties. Our job was to look at the question of religious organizations and how they're operating, and also the question of religious extremism when it occurs. The next thing I want to say, which is a 3rd point, just to re-echo what I think was said by Jamhuri, is that there is already regulation for every person and every organization in this country. Regulation basically means rules. So every organization and every person follows the laws of this country, beginning with the Constitution and the various acts of Parliament. And then in regard to religious organizations, which include churches, they also tend to be regulated. I use the word tend to be regulated because they register and they can register under various forms at the moment. The most common method of registration is under the Societies Act. The current Societies Act was enacted in 1968, so it is 56 years old. And when we started our task, it was 55 years old. It has had a few amendments from time to time, but it is still an old legislative instrument. There have been a lot of improvements in other laws that have been established since. In the area of companies, you have a Companies Act that is much more recent, that 1948. You have organizations that used to be regulated under the Societies Act that were updated and given their own laws. For example, sports clubs, cooperative societies, SACCOs, even political parties were given their own law. And all of them used to be initially regulated under the Societies Act. And when they got their own laws, the ways of regulation were updated, they were modernized, they were given their own institutional frameworks. And so they were given a bit more of an environment that encourages discipline in those sectors. And so for religious organizations, they have remained in the Societies Act together with other kinds of clubs like cultural clubs and so on. The Societies Act, we found, was not completely fit for purpose just because of the passage of time. The next thing I would say is that when we went around the country, we had terms of reference as the Presidential Task Force. Terms of reference, we advertised our attendances so that people would know. In each county that we visited, we explained to the people what are our terms of reference on the areas of religious extremism, on the areas of how churches operate and other religious organizations, and finally on the questions of whether there should be any standards, whether there should be reporting requirements, and mechanisms for enforcement. So those were more or less the three main areas we were focusing on. And we spoke to county governors in most of the counties, to county commissioners in almost all the counties. So we're dealing with both the county government and national government leadership in the counties. We spoke to the security establishment in the counties, and then we had town halls where we were speaking to over 100 people in each town hall. Most of them were religious leaders, pastors, bishops, sheikhs, imams, and so on, and also civil society people and members of the public. And we're asking them the same questions. Why do they think Shakahola happened based on the experience? Are there such kind of incidents in their own counties? What have they seen about religious organizations? So we're really impressed by the feedback we got. And there was a lot of consistent kind of like messages that came to us. We also received memoranda from various stakeholders as we went around the counties and even when we came to Nairobi. And one of the consistent statements that we had is that people wanted to have self-regulation to the extent possible, and they recommended self-regulation through umbrella religious organizations. So if I have my church, for example, and I become a member of a federation of churches or an association of churches, those are the ones that are being called umbrella religious organizations. Some of them are quite well known in this country, so I can mention three of them. National Council of Churches of Kenya, NCCK, that is more than 100 years old and is an umbrella organization for many of the mainstream Protestant churches. Kenya Conference of Catholic Bishops is also an umbrella organization that brings together all the Catholic dioceses in Kenya. And you have Evangelical Alliance of Kenya, which is 40 years old and is an umbrella organization that brings together many evangelical associations. Among the Muslims, you have SUPKEM, Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims, that brings together and represents Muslims generally. You have Council of Imams and Preachers that represents and brings together all the imams and preachers generally across the country, the Islamic faith. You have the Hindu Council that brings together Hindus generally. and so on. So we're saying that if people are in these umbrella religious organizations, these are the recommendations we're getting, they can do much more self-regulation at that level. And this was a consistent comment that came in. And there was also a lot of awareness as we went around the country that religious organizations already relate with the state. There's already an interaction with the state. Because the moment you set up an association, you want to have a name, you want to have people coming together. You're not just an individual, but you're people coming together consistently. You have a leadership, you have a mechanism for deciding who are the leaders. You want to own property, you want to be exempt from taxes. These are the reasons why people register with government agencies. And most churches are registered under the Societies Act. There may be a few that are registered as NGOs or with other formats, even some with company limited by guarantee. But we found that the structure of society is a structure that is used. We also discovered when we engaged the Registrar of Societies that of the tens of thousands of religious organizations that are registered, probably about 60 to 70% do not file regular returns. And they only think of filing returns, which they are required to file annual returns. They only think of filing them when there is a change of leadership. And so the current situation in the sector is not at optimum level. And the religious leaders also complained that right now, the Registrar of Societies is only in Nairobi. They have to travel so far and it is inefficient. They said it needs to be digitized and decentralized to the counties. So there was a lot of positive feedback on that issue. We asked the members of the public and religious leaders as well, what do you think is the cause for extremism? Why are people vulnerable to extremist religious practices? Who is susceptible? We found that people from all over the country are susceptible to religious extremism when they are vulnerable. It could be because of poverty, because of other psychological or social reasons. They are vulnerable and they can be manipulated. So the problem is that even though majority of people of faith and religious leaders are doing a great job, there is a minority, a few rotten apples that have the danger of poisoning the entire batch unless they are dealt with. And of course, the proposal was that they be dealt with first of all internally. When, for example, when Malindi, the Pastors Fellowship, told us that we saw Mackenzie, we saw him coming up. We saw when he started going rogue and doing funny things. We blew the whistle. It was not effective. He was even taken to court. Even the area MP, who was Aisha Jumwa, made a lot of noise. And what did he do? Eventually, he just moved from her constituency to the neighboring Shakahola forest, which was in a different constituency, more remote. And he accelerated the activities that he was involved in. So there were problems of when there are people who engage in criminality under the guise of religion, how do you deal with them? Because the security sector was telling us they find it difficult when people say freedom of religion and they can do a lot of harm. And so there's need to come up with proposals on that area. The Communication Authority also told us, we have a problem because when people are broadcasting religious content, even if it is harmful content, we don't have a proper mechanism or framework for intervening in those cases because they will claim freedom of religion. In the case of Mackenzie, we found out that there are people who went to Shakahola at the coast, all the way from western part of the country, some from Mount Kenya region. They were coming from far. And it was because they were listening to him on broadcast media, and there was no way of regulating. So this was a challenge, and we observed that that was one of the problems. And of course, we also saw that if Kenyans don't know the difference between good practice of religion and religious extremism, then they become vulnerable. So there was a deficit in the area of education, both in basic education curricula and in civic education that needed to be filled. One of the other things that I would like to say, just to clarify, is that we also notice that there's need to improve the way religious organizations organize and order themselves. There was no recommendation for re-registration. Let me clarify that. But we noted that if there is a new law and a new mechanism for updating the register, there would be need for religious organizations to update their particulars. So the draft bill of the Presidential Task Force talks about updating particulars, not about registration. But what happened is that because there were all these initiatives, the Senate, when they finished their job of the ad hoc committee, they produced a draft bill. And that draft bill is the one that has been slightly revised and now published in the Senate as the Mungatana bill. And many church leaders are concerned about some of the contents of that Mungatana bill. And when the Presidential Task Force also finished its work, it came up with a draft bill that is a Presidential Task Force bill. The Task Force bill is still in draft form because it is awaiting an implementation committee. That was a recommendation of the task force to the president that will then usher that bill in collaboration with stakeholders like the AG, getting feedback from religious leaders, will usher it to the process where it can be tabled in the National Assembly as a bill. One of the interesting things is that when you look at the fourth schedule to the Constitution, this is a schedule that identifies what are the functions of county government and the functions of national government, because national government has functions in the counties and county government also has functions in the counties. One of the functions of national government, which is the fourth paragraph of national government in the fourth schedule, is the relationship between religion and state. So this is a function that national government should play.
Is it just on my end, or did we lose Wakili Kanjama?
No, we've lost him. We've lost him.
Can you hear me now?
You're back.
Yes,
You're back.
now we can hear you.
Sorry. So I think the last thing I was saying was I was talking about the Constitution, and I was saying that the fourth schedule provides national government with the function of relationship between religion and the state. And this is not in the county government functions. And the Senate is meant to handle matters that relate to county government functions. So some are even questioning whether the Senate was really undertaking its business when it did the job it did. Although I can say that the ad hoc committee did a good job, but now when the Senate has gone ahead with the Mungatana bill, it seems that they may be overstepping. And in fact, it is that Mungatana bill that has now caused a lot of controversy. Several groups, including Evangelical Alliance of Kenya, including the Anglicans, have issued statements opposed to the Mungatana bill. So it's important to see that distinction between Mungatana bill and the Presidential Task Force. Some of the key recommendations of the force is to have a religious affairs commission that will help to secure independence of the religious organizations, even as they relate with the state. Because you've seen in the Constitution, the approach of securing independence of several sectors is through commissions. When teachers wanted to be independent, they had Teacher Service Commission. Parliament, to secure its independence, has Parliamentary Service Commission. Judiciary has Judicial Service Commission, and so on. When Kenyans felt that the process of determining salaries of state officers should be independent from those state officers, they recommended Salaries and Remuneration Commission. So commissions have been given protection in the Constitution, and they secure a measure of independence for those executive or parliamentary or judicial institutions. And we know that a statute can also create a commission that is given constitutional protection like IPOA has done for independent policing oversight authorities. So the Presidential Task Force recommended a Religious Affairs Commission that is manned or is led by people who include a majority of representatives from the religious sector, people who know religious organizations, who will have oversight over the whole sector, who will be the ones with oversight over the registrar, so that decisions of the registrar to register, to refuse to register, or to recommend the registration will be subject to the Religious Affairs Commission. We also noted that part of the crisis in the religious sector is internal disagreements and disputes, court fights, and other kind of stalemate because of disagreement resulting in fragmentation and so on. And we recommended a Religious Affairs Disputes Tribunal. The judiciary told us there are too many religious disputes in the courts. Can we have a mechanism where they are resolved before coming to the courts? And we recommended that religious disputes first be resolved in each religious organization. They should have clauses in their constitution on dispute resolution. And when they are not able to resolve the dispute internally, they consider using the mechanism of the umbrella religious organization that they are part of, because most religious organizations are expected to become part of umbrella religious organizations. And the umbrella religious organization will determine the issues of self-regulation of those churches or mosques, etc. One of the important issues also we dealt with was the question of, should there be minimum academic standards? And I can tell you that when we were in Lodwar, I was in Lodwar with other members of the task force, 1/3, because we were in 3 teams. I remember that one of the ladies who spoke to us very passionately, she said that, you see, here in Turkana, we have very dedicated religious leaders, clergy. We have very dedicated clergy. They're inspired, they have the spirit, they are really serving the church and the community well. And many of them have not even finished class 8. They did not go up to class 8. Many of them have not reached Form 4 for sure. And these people are serving us well. And I remember one thing she told us. She told us, you members of the task force, when you go back to Nairobi, don't come up with rules that stop our clergy from ministering to us just because they have not met some academic standards that you have established there in Nairobi. So we really reflected on this issue, because of course one of the things that is causing indiscipline is when people who lack any form of training in religion, they establish religious organizations or start using them. Some of them are con men and women. They could be businessmen who want to engage in money laundering, and they decide to use churches. So we reflected on this issue. And eventually we thought, after we consulted the church leaders, the other religious leaders, the umbrella organizations, that each religion has its own different standards for educating their religious leaders. Imams and sheikhs, imams and preachers have their standards. The Hindus know the standards for the Hindu ministers, and the Christian umbrella organizations know what should be the minimum standard. So we made a recommendation that it should be the umbrella religious organizations to determine what should be the academic standards or other standards of those who will become clergy under the organizations that are in that umbrella. So these are some of the main recommendations that were made. And we felt that if the religious sector is not improved in terms of getting better laws, better governance structures, and so on, things will keep deteriorating. Not because majority of people in the sector are dishonest or not well-intentioned, but because when you don't have a good framework, first of all, you create an environment for rotten apples to infect the bunch. And secondly, even for those who are good, when they disagree, even with very good intentions among each other, there is no effective framework for resolving the disagreements. Before I conclude, let me also say that apart from listening to Kenyans, because that was the job of the task force, We also listened to stakeholders in Nairobi. We studied various laws. We did benchmarking. Even, for example, the matatu sector is a very interesting case study of how the government put matatus in circles so that there could be a bit more discipline in the sector. We looked at the way religion is regulated in other countries. We did some benchmarking visits, and we did also a lot of desk studies. And we saw differences from one country to another: United States, United Kingdom, India, Rwanda, Tanzania, and so on. And so we were guided by this also, taking into account our unique history in making recommendations that we thought would work best for religious organizations in Kenya. So that's really a summary of the background information. Most importantly is to know that the Mungatana bill that is in the Senate is quite distinct from the proposed bill of the Presidential Task Force. The Presidential Task Force also proposed a draft policy for religious organizations, as well as proposed draft regulations. And that is the current situation. So we can now have further discussion based on that additional background information.
Thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive explanation, and thank you for the correction on the re-registration. That was my everybody stands to be corrected. Thank you for that correction. And we'd like to give, we've seen Prof has come on. We will give him an opportunity to maybe give his input at the moment, and then we'll keep going around. Thank you very much. That was a very well done job, very thoroughly done. And it's always good to be able to have a conversation from as an informed position as possible. And it seems you guys were very thorough in what you were able to follow up. Jamhuri, did you want to say something? It seems like you've...
Oh, yes, Wallace. I just a very quick question for Wakili, also as part of providing context. Shakahola happened, absolutely horrific. What were the findings of the task force regarding, what went wrong? Where was the ball dropped? So even without the regulation, could this have been prevented? Or are we saying without the regulation, things just went the way they did, and that there was absolutely nothing that could have been done? I don't know if that question makes sense.
Yeah, I can attempt to answer the question. That was Wallace, I think. Okay, so Jamhuri. Okay, very well. So the first thing I would like to say, just to give some clarification, is that when the president decided to respond and react to the Shakahola tragedy, he actually established two entities. He established a presidential task force to look into the religious organization space. And its role or its terms of reference were quite broad. It was to look at religious extremism, and not just Shakahola, but other instances. For example, Garissa University, Dusit, Westgate, and so on. There have been terrorist attacks that were inspired or allegedly inspired by religion. Those are instances of religious extremism. And the president also established a judicial commission of inquiry. And the idea of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry was to do a much more systematic investigation into Shakahola. So the job of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry was to get witnesses, investigate what happened. It was almost like the way sometimes the state establishes an inquest when you have people who have died in mysterious circumstances. Unfortunately for the president, there was a challenge, a legal challenge to the constitutionality of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry, and it was stopped by a court order after the members were sworn in. And so it never did its job. So the Presidential Task Force job was not to investigate and give findings of a legal nature on Shakahola. But the Senate, when it established its ad hoc committee, it decided to investigate more closely why Shakahola happened. And the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights also did a bit. So you have a mix of findings from these three organs. None of them was a judicial commission of inquiry. For the Senate, I think part of their findings was that there were failures, both of the police establishment, of the legal establishment. There are failures in reporting, in enforcement. There were failures in regulation of communication avenues. They found several failures that led to Shakahola. And they also discussed what is a cult, what is cultism, what makes people vulnerable to join a cult. And so they found all those. In the case of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, they identified several actors who should do more in order to unearth the various aspects of the Shakahola tragedy, including the government pathologist and so on. In the case of the Presidential Task Force, because by the time we were doing a report, we were already aware of what the Senate committee had reported, we found that their observations were quite useful. And the Presidential Task Force also found that, again, there were gaps that affected several people, including the legal sectors. You see, the people in the legal sector told us that they didn't know what else to do. They had taken Mackenzie to court. They had gone to a forest. There was not effective presence of the government where he was. And so they gave us their own information, feeling that there was need for a stronger regulatory framework to support their work. And more importantly, they felt there was need for more effective mechanisms of collaboration between the religious sector and the security sectors. For example, you have interfaith groups in different counties that were set up after COVID came up. And these interfaith groups have been very effective when necessary in working with the security sector when there are issues that relate to religion and the state. When we went to Tanzania, for example, we found out that other countries have also had challenges. Even Tanzania has had its challenges, and they have a kind of like a baraza that includes the main umbrella religious organizations there. 3 to represent the Christians, 1 or 2 to represent the Muslims, I don't remember. They have about 5 religious umbrella organizations that coordinate with the state when they have issues. Sometimes you have tensions between people of different faiths, and the government has found it very useful to use this baraza of the umbrella religious organizations that operates almost like the Interreligious Council of Kenya. So we saw there were gaps, but many of those gaps came together to result in this outcome. And to resolve those gaps is why we give the proposals on issues of education, on issues of order in religious organizations and their governance, in issues of improving the laws, and so on.
Thank you very much. Now we can give opportunity to Professor Kivutha to put in his query, and then we'll go into the comment section, as well as now the initial people who gave their initial submissions and the ones on the speakers panel. So Professor Kivutha, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Senior Counsel Charles Kanjama, for a very, very elaborate presentation to this space of, what exactly happened in terms of the task force. One, of course, wishes that this was done not as a reaction to something like a Shakahola, because usually when the backdrop of a task force is something as horrendous as that, there will be this feeling that whatever comes up is due to a reaction of something of that nature, and therefore its objectivity some people can say that there is a problem with objectivity. So, but that was the trigger. We have to accept that that was the trigger. And I think many of the issues that are being raised, not just in this space, but countrywide, relate to the fact that the task force and even the Mungatana initiative are viewed to have been the subject of something that happened, and therefore it's like reactionary. But as I said, that's now water under the bridge. I think from what you have described to us, and from even the prior conversations among us, there is that critical thing of can the state take this opportunity to have regulation which, although it might look like it is very objective and all that, but the state as a foot in terms of being able to kind of control to some extent the religious sector. And of course, because here the emphasis is in this debate, the emphasis is the church, and this is the majority of the 80% or so of citizens in our country. So I think in terms of whether it is the Mungatana bill, whether it is what you have very eloquently proposed in terms of the draft policy, the draft bill, regulations, one has to really look at them very, very, very carefully, because as there is now public participation again, when they are presented to Parliament, it is likely that there will be some changes and so on and so forth. So I think one must still emphasize that we are very careful, very deliberate, so that what Shakaula represented is not used by the state to have some foothold into how the church can be regulated in a negative way. And of course, there's another backdrop of during elections, the political people come into the churches and they try to influence them so that they can help them in terms of the elections and in politics and so on. And therefore, one again has to look at all this, the policy, the bill, the regulations, to be sure that they will not allow a foothold, a greater foothold of the political people within the religious space and the church space for this matter. I think if there is the emphasis on self-regulation, I think that is the most critical thing, so that really the balance is for self-regulation. And that becomes very clear, because even within the Religious Affairs Commission, it is not a constitutional commission, because if it was a constitutional commission, that is a commission within the constitution, like IEBC, like the PSC, TSC. If it was within the constitution, then it would be clear that it's a strong. But even when sometimes there are fewer people in government, we have seen in commissions where those people tend to have some dominance. So that is also something else to look at very, very carefully, the structure of that Religious Affairs Commission, to look at the roles of the government functionaries within them, so that it is clear that the representation that you have very articulately brought forward in terms of in terms of the umbrella organizations, so that becomes very clear. You know, we have seen the EACC sometimes, you know, being kind of dominated, you know, by government, the government officials. Even IPOA itself, which you mentioned, we have seen that it is not always easy for them to kind of control the police. So I think it will be necessary, therefore, to look at that religious commission to be sure that, of course, the best situation would be if it was within the constitution, just like there's the freedom of worship and all those issues that were mentioned earlier in terms of the constitutional, the preamble, Article 8, Article 32, articles about you can't discriminate on basis of religion and so on and so forth. Then even the umbrella organizations, I think it is important that the law there makes it in such a way that they may not also make it difficult for incoming denominations. And you know, there was a talk within an earlier presentation. There was talk of sometimes it is thought that the dominant, the mainstream, what we call the mainstream, can also have a problem in terms of admitting, you know, what are thought to be small churches or denominations and so on and so forth. So even in that space, so that there isn't self-regulation which advantages just the mainstream and disadvantages others. Of course, I think we have to be also very careful about this special criminality issuing from things that are being done religiously, because if it is terrorism, there is law to look, there is law to deal with that. If it is noise pollution, if it is you know, for all those laws, even if you teach, you have religious content, just like other secular content, which makes it difficult, which you know, you make people do wrong things. There is also law for that. So I think it is perhaps not good to come up with criminal with criminal stuff in a law about religion. It should be in the penal code, or it should be, you know, in those places, so that it is law which applies to anybody who does things of that particular kind. And it's not enough for the communications authority to say that people are doing wrong things and saying this is religious freedom. The DPP or whoever should be able to prove that this is unacceptable, just like if somebody else. Because I'm saying this just to indicate that we can begin to have laws that are specific to the region, and we are not we the state and religion separation, and we begin actually to undermine religion through such specific laws. But they should be broad, and they should be, you know, laws just like in the penal code, and they reside there. They reside there. If I can just to kind of, because so that I don't take too long, the academic standards thing. I think what you were told in North Rift is valid, because even in the some people who have done a lot of mechanics or who have done a lot of plumbing, that prior knowledge can be certified. So even as even as the umbrella organizations look at these people, then that is also something to be, careful about, because yes, we don't want people don't have, I mean, they have rogue doctrine. One even can't call it doctrine, to really confuse people and to do all the negative stuff. But what I think I have heard you say, and also Kanjama, I have heard you say, senior counsel, is we need to look at what some of the proposals that you have made in terms of organizing, if one can just talk about the church, organizing the church for the sake of the church, so that there is a better, like if it is the disputes, people don't keep on disputing and doing terrible things and being used as you look at those Christians, they can't agree, they what do they preach? Like Mahatma Gandhi once said, if Christians really did what Christ was about, then he himself would also be a Christian. So I think we should also look at what that task force has done, in terms of there are elements there which help the church to become, if I can say, quote quote, better, and that is positive. And I think but also clarify that there are no things about taxation, so that, because that's one other thing, the reporting, that is important. Even these faiths regulate themselves before they go under the Societies Act, because most of them were registered there. Then there is also that bad practice of one denomination which is registered itself registering some other many, so that they are under it. It's like they are under it, and they pay quote quote attacks to the person who is already registered. So that things like those ones, so that there is a kind of better order. And therefore, I think it will be important for that Mungatana thing to really be stepped down. And then as we do public participation, there's a better, because when you went out, like you said, you would have like 100 people in a county town hall. So that now there is more, people discussing, so that there is good consensus, and also to know that, without that consensus, I think people will really, particularly the Christian church, will really think that this is a law which is taking away from what they have from the Constitution, and from, of course, from our belief in terms of what the Christian church is about. But we thank you for your eloquence, and also the work in terms of bringing out those issues. And I think as we continue to the debate, it will be clearer and clearer that this is not something to do harm, but all those questions to be looked at, so that people are comfortable. It's a huge step in the country, and let's go well within what eventually will be done. And I don't know whether Bishop Ndichu is around. If he was, who is also a lawyer, and in some discussions he has some issues to also share. If he was around, maybe he could also say something, and I yield.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jamhuri, you can check if he's in the.
He is around, and I have extended the mic.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much for that submission. And even as we give senior counsel an opportunity to give his rejoinder, he might also even give us a good idea of, since he's a Christian as well, how well we would organize thorough public participation in the church, so that some of those things, the feelings that people have, like, is this thing coming to crush our faith? Are they trying to regulate our sermons, etc., etc.? Welcome, senior counsel, to rejoin.
Okay, very well. Thank you for that. I think Prof, who has also been my teacher in the past, has given very insightful comments as usual and explored various aspects that have to be carefully looked at. And I think they have all been very useful and helpful comments. One thing that we are aware, those of us who are in the task force, is the danger of the work of the task force being conflated with what output has come from Mungatana. And in fact, one of the things that I've had to do in several forums of religious leaders is to explain the difference, because when the task force report came out and the bill, we had several sessions where we explained the task force report, and there was a lot of very positive acceptance of the work of the task force, and the religious leaders looked to be in substantial support, at least in the forums I attended. And then after a few weeks, we started receiving a screenshot saying, "Is this your bill?" And we were also in shock because we were seeing contents of a bill that was not of the presidential task. Discovered that actually there is a Mungatana bill that has been published. So you see, for Mungatana, because it was a Senate committee, there were no religious sector people inside the committee that was coming up with the recommendations. A few religious organizations sent their memoranda, but there were no religious people in that sector, in that committee. It was quite different in the presidential task force. I had so many religious leaders there. When we'd have discussions, I remember they would tell me, "Kanjama, please, we cannot afford to throttle the church. We must ensure that whatever recommendations we make will not be misused by the state." The very same sentiments that Professor Kibwana has so eloquently stated. And I think we made very deliberate efforts, even in the design of the report, the policy, and the bill, to deal with those concerns, because they were being discussed within the task force. And I think that is a key difference between the presidential task force and the Mungatana committee. I think the other difference is that we went around the country to every county, and we received a tremendous amount of input from religious leaders. And so the presidential task force report is largely the outcome of the views we received, synthesized, harmonized, and then benchmarked with the best practices elsewhere. And I think that is also something else that is important, that in the question of regulation, Kenya is not an island. The challenges we are facing of religious extremism have been there in the United Kingdom, in the United States. There was a certain Jones who did something similar to Shakahola, I think in 1979. So it was very useful to see what is happening in other countries. And we avoided the temptation of compelling everyone who is engaged in religion to have to register. So those who register are those who need to enjoy the benefits of registration, but nothing stops you from engaging in religious practice in your home, in your school, with whatever group you want to. We also fought against the temptation of compelling people, and this is unfortunately a difference with the Mungatana report, who are engaged in religion from having to be registered members of a church or a mosque. We also listened to the Muslims, the Sheikh, and so on, so that we could understand the way Islam works, how do they deal with extremism, and I think we came up with a very good compromise. On the question of taxation also, we took a fairly distinct approach to the Mungatana one, which threatens to bring in taxation to churches, even though they have tried to distinguish between income that comes from tithes and donations and gifts and income that comes from economic activity. But you can see an opening to taxation. So we took a number of distinct approaches. I think a professor has made it clear that there is no institutional framework that cannot be misused or abused. Whether you set up a commission, even if it is a constitutional commission, it can be abused. And I think we were very conscious of that fact. And we thought that the institutional arrangement should be one that is designed to favor more freedom as opposed to
I think we've lost you. Jamhuri, can you hear him?
No, we
No, we lost him.
Sorry, I'm back.
Okay.
Something happened to my phone.
No problem. Welcome.
Yeah, so let me just finish. Sorry. Yeah, so saying we try to have that approach where we would favor a preferential approach where you have religion thriving as opposed to operating only with the permission of the state, which our constitution does not countenance that approach. Regarding the comment of whether it is proper to have specific criminal laws in regard to religion or to just leave them with the general laws, I think I was reflecting on all the statutes we have in Kenya. The moment you have an act of parliament to regulate anything, you'll always find 2 or 3 criminal provisions in that statute. Even under the Societies Act, you have several criminal provisions for people who don't comply with the society's law. So even religious organizations, as they are currently regulated under the Societies Act, are subject to those criminal laws under the Societies Act. And so if they were to be carved out of the Societies Act and given their own law, there would still be a few criminal provisions, because it is not possible to have a law tell people you should do things this way without any sort of enforcement mechanism. And I think for us, the question of whether the existing penal laws are adequate, when we did benchmarking and we studied the situation on the ground, because we discovered Shakahola is not an isolated case. We saw that there are other Shakaholas in the making. And none of them have become Shakahola, but we found out from several security agencies in other parts of the country, Shakaholas in the making. And this was something very troubling, because clearly there was a deficit in the way the law had been designed or was being applied. And so we thought that giving a bit of clarity that educates both the security agencies and Kenyans and people in religious organizations that religion can also be abused and cause harm was something important to do. So I think I've just given a few comments to bring out the fact that the Presidential Task Force appreciated quite a bit the threat or the risk that Prof has mentioned. Of course, the outcome of the Presidential Task Force is not perfect. It needs improvements as any human device. But that was part of the thing we're very conscious about. And I would like to say, for example, regarding the concern that the Presidential Task Force may have thought of an approach that might favor the larger churches. One of the terms of reference of the Presidential Task Force was to study sects, and sects in our terms of reference were kind of like addressed in a pejorative sense. And I remember I was one of the people who mentioned that even Christianity began as a Jewish sect, according to the Jews of the time of Jesus and the apostles. And many of the mainstream churches may have begun as sects when they were breaking away from other mainstream churches, and they have now become mainstream. And I think I made it clear, I emphasized as a lawyer to my colleagues, professionals, and even religious leaders that based on Article 32 of the Constitution, even if I set up my own religious organization, whether it is a ministry or whatever it is, and we are 20 or 30, we still have the freedom of religion. And I think we were very conscious. Thankfully, the sector that was most represented in the task force were evangelicals. And there was a feeling that evangelicals are the ones who have the largest number of religious organizations, including many of the small ones or the SME. And they were there to help us to understand the spirit of evangelicalism and to protect the interests of the smaller churches. So I think we made an effort to do that in the outcome of the report, and would welcome a continued engagement with the report, continued criticism, observations, suggestions for improvement. And we hope ultimately that the implementation committee will be set up so that it can receive these structured comments from Kenyans and then usher in the next stage of the intended reforms in the way religions operate within this country.
Thank you very much. Let's Talk has raised their hand for quite a while. I will go to Let's Talk, then go to Redemptor. But Let's Talk, you have the mic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, and for the speakers that have given their insight, and special recognition to Senior Counsel Charles Kanjama and Professor Kivutha Kibwana. I have two main concerns or questions regarding the discussion tonight. And I understand the position of self-regulation because, religious organizations, in the view of some people, should be allowed to regulate themselves, through maybe internal councils or associations that they can help them maintain ethical standards and, keep the focus on ensuring that religious leaders who have a lot of influence exercise good moral authority to reduce cases of abuse and corruption. And that is all okay. But my specific concern, number one, is that many vulnerable communities fall prey to religious exploitation, where they're asked for money, sometimes in exchange for miracles or blessings and things like that. We've had many such stories. So what steps can or should be taken to protect such vulnerable communities from exploitation, whether through self-regulation or if the state passes legislation? How can this be done so that these rogue religious leaders who manipulate them for financial gain are held accountable? And if we opt for self-regulation, is there a mechanism for escalation, maybe for law enforcement? And is it possible to get an example or an overview of how things would go if a church, say, or a mosque even, is found to have emotionally or financially exploited its congregants? What could this look like in when it is under self-regulation, and would it be dealt entirely by the church, or would there be processes to escalate to law enforcement, and what would this look like? Just an example. And then my second question, my last question, is how can we leverage technology to create a balance between transparency, accountability, and maintaining religious freedom in our religious institutions, and more specifically churches? Because as we go on and as things advance, even just by global standards, it's very prudent that to remain future-proof and to be at par with the world and how things are evolving socially and many other ways, that we embrace technology, and we have mechanisms that are as dynamic as the changes occurring around us to ensure protection of our congregants. So are there ways maybe the task force recommended or is willing to consider, in which we can leverage technology to achieve the goal? Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much. We can have Redemptor go, then you can rejoin to both queries at the same time. Redemptor, kindly, you have the mic.
Thank you very much, Wallace, Jane, Kariuki, Jamhuri, the host of this show. It's unfortunate I've come late. I forgot about, I had really purpose to be here. I would have loved to hear Senior Counsel Kanjama's presentation, but I'll replay the presentation. Now, the first thing I'll say is that some of you know that I dedicated 12 months to documenting the Shakahola massacre, and I don't like people to call it a thing because people died. And in this case, I will tell you for free that self-regulation failed, because when now you're dealing with a criminal, can you hear me?
Very well, go ahead.
When we
You're
are
clear.
dealing with a crime, then people start saying this is religion. So this is a very unique situation where in this country, I don't know if anyone has noticed, we stopped having witch doctors and we have Waombezi. So the lines are blurred in terms of, even if we talk of regulation, society itself has not realized that now occultism is deemed as church. You go to informal settlements, you find people in small rooms praying for people. But what they are diviners. So the lines are so blurred that even if we do what we do in Kenya, which is hiding Kenyan problems in reports and task forces. Now, in the case of the bill, if I can go to the bill, should the state regulate church? If the church had not misbehaved, and we have to admit the church misbehaved in the last 10, 12 years, then it would be the responsibility of the church to regulate the state. It would be the opposite. And because of that, we have very many pockets of vulnerable communities then who are then exploited by these conmen because they are not really pastors. In terms of the person who has made this bill, who has proposed this bill, Mungatana, it is very unfortunate because apart from the latest report, I think led by Reverend Motaba Musemi, I've looked at most of all the other reports that came about as a result of the massacre that happened in Kilifi. And the worst of them is the ad hoc Senate committee. That was the worst. 232 pages of useless things. There was only one page in that whole report that captured what had happened in Shakahola. And so when I see them coming up with another bill, I look at it as an opportunity to hold town hall meetings and just kukula. It's ill, the timing is very wrong. It's coming at a time when Kenya is already in a very bad place in terms of our spirituality, our emotions, our economics. And the biggest thing that we are seeing is, what are the levels? What is the problem? The problem is economic exploitation. In this case, I always say I read all these reports and nobody seems to capture that what happened in Shakahola was occultism disguised as a church. Secondly, it was also a man who declared in 2019, I have stopped being a pastor. Yet everyone who talks about him uses the word pastor. So now when you use it as an excuse to say, let's regulate the church, you're conning us. You're taking advantage. And I think, because I'm very vocal about the need to liberate this country, I think people are playing here with numbers, because the people who control numbers, the citizenry, is the church and politicians. And they are fighting for the same. So I think it's an excuse to say, let's bring a bill to regulate you. And then now the church will be begging the government because they don't want to be regulated, because if you're told you'll be regulated, you feel threatened. So I think the Kenyan problem here is people are so vulnerable. They are willing to kunywa mafuta taa, to buy special sand, to buy special nails. If we'd fix this nation, in fact, the church should use this opportunity to consolidate like they did in the 90s and save all these masses of people who are suffering. Kenya is, people are on their knees and they're not praying to God. So when you come and attack a church and say, let's regulate a church at such a time as this, then where do you send these people? Hospitals don't work. So people are still going to church for mchangas when their loved ones are sick. And then there's this extreme of people who have mental, because a lot of these, when you see over religiosity and religious psychosis, those are people with mental health problems. Those are people who've broken down. And so they find themselves in these little corners and they call it church. So I have a lot to say about this topic. So I'll just keep it to the government cannot regulate church at this time. The timing is wrong. The bill is at the wrong time because the same Senate committee, the ad hoc committee, failed 250 something families. To date, we have bodies in a container. So you can't come and tell me. In fact, I feel like the church is playing itself. The church should have investigated what happened in Shakahola. It would not have cost the church much. These all politicians should have read these reports independently without having to be in any committee. And then now they can confidently go and walk to Mungatana and tell him, do not use this as an excuse to disrupt us. In fact, the church should now mobilize around saving this nation because people are hurting and not saving themselves that, oh, now we are under attack, we are being regulated. I do not think this is the time to regulate. I'm getting feedback. I don't know whose mic is on.
Thanks, Redemptor. Maybe you wrap up your comment.
No, listen, I would really, my kind of feel is you have a part 2 of this, then I listen to the first part, and then I can make my input. Thank you for the great conversation. It is timely, and the discussion needs to be explored further because we need the church. This country needs the church. I mean, I would love to beat the church up for their failures in the past, but if they are ever needed, it is a time as this, and not to fight for themselves. Let the regulation find them busy trying to help the citizenry. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Redemptor. Thank you, Redemptor. We'll ask Senior Counsel to rejoin on that. And of course, definitely, we feel, even when we look at the time, we definitely need a part 2 of this. We will extend the invitation to Senior Counsel if he will agree. But kindly, you can rejoin to those 2 speakers who have preceded, Redemptor and our previous speaker.
Wallace,
Okay,
can I ask something?
Oh, yes.
Can I ask something to that?
You know, I'm forgetting. Maybe I respond to this too, then I can respond to anything else because I'll forget what has been said.
I understand.
And the speakers as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so Let's Talk was the first person who made a comment. And I think the thought that came to my mind is that there is a temptation. It is an attractive temptation about regulating or monitoring doctrine or teachings or practices of people of a different religious dispensation. And the thing about religion is that all of us who are people of faith or people who believe in religion, we always think our religion is a true religion. If I'm Muslim, I think Islam is true and the other religions are erroneous. If I'm Hindu, the same. If I'm Christian, the same. I think I'm the one who's exactly in the right. If I'm Christian and we have different denominations, I think that my denomination is the one that has the exactly right understanding. And the others are right to the extent that they agree with my perspective. That tends to be the way we approach religion. And it is to be expected because we are all looking for truth, and faith is a promise to lead us to the truth through belief. And so because of this one, there would be a danger if regulation of religion or whatever engagement of religion, whether at the level of umbrella religious organizations or otherwise, became an external test by one person based on their creed or set of beliefs against another person's set of beliefs. The approach that our courts have taken generally in matters that involve a need for religious tolerance and sometimes some conflict between religious practices is to say that in the area of conscience or belief, you have full freedom to believe what you'd like to believe about God, so long as it doesn't cause harm to others. But in the area of beliefs, if they don't cause harm, would not be regulated, and there would be no interest of the state, for example, in that area. But in regard to action, because religion involves two dimensions, what you believe and then what you do in accordance with those beliefs. In regard to action, there is a standard to determine whether these religious practices are good or harmful. And that standard is the standard of harm. Do they cause harm to life, to health of people, economic and otherwise? Standard. And our constitution, of course, has indicated values there, including human rights. So is this religion causing a physical harm? Is it causing this kind of damage to people's savings and so on? So to the extent that you can have an objective test, which is outcome-based, then the state or any agency can come in. Even if I am a pastor and you are a pastor in a different church, I can see, based on the objective standard, that you are misusing religion. So at that level of the objective standard is when, for example, the Malindi Pastors Fellowship came in and expressed concern about Mackenzie. Both about his teachings and his practices. So that is the area where religion needs to be reviewed in accordance with the test of, is it causing good or causing harm? And for us, our basic principle was that religion is a good thing in itself, leave alone the social work that is done by people of religion in the area of education, health, charitable work, and so on. Religion in itself is a good thing. It helps people individually in their spiritual dimension, psychologically, and so on. Contributes to good. I remember we were in one county in the western part of this country, and a certain pastor spoke. And what she told us is that she's very disappointed that after Shakahola, casual insults are being thrown at pastors and they are being called Mackenzie. And she was very offended. Why are we being called Mackenzie and we are doing so much good? One of the things she said is even the government should be very thankful to us. In all these decades, they are unable to reform people who they convict, they take to committee and to other maximum prisons and minimum prisons. In fact, the people get worse. And she told us that in my ministry, I have people who used to be drunkards, they have been reformed. People who are criminals, they have been reformed. We are able to do something which the state is not able to, even when they throw a lot of money at the problem. Even just at that level of personal change, behavior change, and transformation, the state should be very happy with what we do. But we are not doing it for the reason of the state to be happy with us. It's for a higher reason. It's for a transcendental purpose. So for me, I think that that is a sentiment that I have heard from the various comments and questions, that religion is generally good, which is true, but it can be abused. And the second comment or question of Let's Talk was about whether digital technology can be used. For the Presidential Task Force, one clear recommendation is that the registration process should be digitized, just like the way registration of companies can now be done online. That recommendation has been done, and we said it's an administrative recommendation. It doesn't need a law to be put into effect. And the Registrar of Societies committed to us that even if the law doesn't pass, with the current regime of registration of societies, they have sought for a budget and they are going to begin a process of digitization of the Registrar of Societies, which will also tremendously help churches and mosques and temples and other such institutions. Redemptor had many comments. Unfortunately, she had not had the presentation which addressed some of the comments, but she also had various useful comments. And one of the ones I liked is when she talked about Waombezi, because when we were at the coast, in Kwale, Kilifi, Mombasa, they commented to us a lot about this issue of Waombezi. And I was just thinking as she was talking that Kenya has a Witchcraft Act. In case you don't know, it is a short statute, but it is a statute that was used very strongly, including in the colonial times, because witchcraft sometimes involves an element of mysticism, with an element of deliberate conmanship sometimes, and psychological manipulation of people. And now we were being told that you have Waombezi who organize rooms there and they pray for people, and they are kind of like a mix between expressed Christianity and actions that are close to witchcraft. And the people there were expressing concern. What do we do about this Waombezi? And of course, if the Waombezi are praying for you and they're saying that's the religion, and they're not using conmanship, they're not using psychological manipulation that is clear trickery, then that is a question of religion. The most you can do is to empower citizens to distinguish better between religion that has positive fruits and that with negative fruits. But if they engage in actions that involve fraud, misrepresentation, then that is a different thing. I can give an example. If I hold a crusade and I want to say that people are receiving miracles, miracles as people of faith and Christians, we believe in miracles. Even Jesus Christ coming to earth was a miracle in itself, we believe. But if you have a preacher who then hires an actor who comes and pretends to be a cripple, he gets into a wheelchair, he folds his legs so that he looks like he's a cripple, and then suddenly he's touched in the crusade and he jumps up and says, "Oh, I've been cured." Of course, that is trickery. That is something that should not be allowed in a civilized society. But if it is a genuine miracle, fine. So what we are saying is that there are people who have been involved in a lot of conmanship that has been going on unabated, alongside those who are engaged in genuine religion. And so there is need to have some interventions that can create a mechanism for inquiring into those who are engaged in open acts of trickery and taking action against them. But that taking action should not be a question of using a thermometer to determine are your doctrines true, because every person in their doctrine are based on matters of religion. And I'm not preaching relativism, because not every religion can be true, of course, if they believe opposite things. But freedom of religion, which is one of our fundamental rights and freedoms in Article 32 of the Constitution, means that it is not the job of the state to determine for the citizen which is a true religion. In a marketplace, a free marketplace where religious ideas thrive, it is assumed and hoped that people who are well educated will be able to search for themselves and find the true religion that leads them to God and is in accordance with the world that has been created by God. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Council. Prof, I think you had a question, then we'll go to Maura and come back to Bishop. Well, thank you for joining us. Prof, I think you had a slight question, and then we'll come to...
Yes, a very quick one. Yes, a very quick one. I just wanted to ask Senior Counsel the extent to which within the work of the task force, there was recognition of the developmental work that is done by religious organizations and the church in this instance of this debate, because sometimes that is not recognized, and sometimes it's also the impediments towards doing it, like whether it's in, and he didn't mention education, hospitals, all the works, because that would be an important also aspect to safeguard. I yield.
Very quickly, in the background, chapter 1 of the task force report, we've discussed those social benefits of religious organizations, including with some data in the area of education and religion. So I think it is something, as Prof has said, very important to keep in mind that religious organizations do a lot of charitable work. I think where I have a bit of a concern with the Mungatana bill is where there is an assumption that when the religious organizations engaged in education and religion, they are doing something for the public benefit. But when they are just engaged in normal acts of worship, it may not be for the public benefit. For us, we believe that the act of religion in itself is for both individual and public benefit. It contributes to peace, harmony, tolerance, and so on when it is done. And then in addition to that, of course, all this social work, education, health, other charitable work, which is frequently associated with religious people, also needs to be promoted. And one of the things that we heard from pastors and imams around the country is they were saying, please recommend that we get effective tax exemption for the work that religious people do that is of a charitable nature or that benefits the country. And we saw that in other countries like the UK, you may not be compelled to register as a religious organization, but when you register and are recognized under the Charities Commission, you get tax exemption. The same thing in the United States of America. If your church engages in politics, it will lose its tax exemption. So there are certain things that may make you lose tax exemption, but generally, the laws are put in such a way that they encourage religious people to engage in religion, and the tax mechanism or laws recognize that this is a positive work that should be exempt from taxes.
Thank you. I wanted to give an opportunity, Brother Maura, at least now that you've been listening in, do you have some more queries regarding the same to the council?
Yes, no. Thank you, Council. Me, I don't have a question, or what I can say is something I would like to say when we are just about to close the space. I have no question for Senior Council Kajama.
Thank you. Then we'll welcome Mheshimiwa Bishop Ndicho. Can you have the microphone? Karibu.
Can you hear me? Can I be heard?
Loud and clear.
Yes, Mheshimiwa. Yes.
Thank you very much. I have listened to this conversation and this discourse since it started, and it is very interesting. I am Honorable Stephen Dicho. My Mwalimu Professor Kivutha Kibwana is my professor in law at the University of Nairobi. And he also invited me to this talk this evening, and I'm very grateful, Mwalimu. I am a bishop also of the Gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm born again. I have listened to this conversation. I have read the entire Mugatana bill. I have read the entire proposed bill by the former Attorney General Muturi on the same. I have heard from Wakili Charles Kajama that the task force is also coming up with their bill similar to all these other ones about religious organizational regulations and stuff like that. We have met severally as a House of Bishops and House of Clergy. And what I would like to tell you is that the church in this country feels threatened by these very many laws that are being made against one sector of this country or the population of this country. We feel profiled by all what is happening. And when we look at the genesis of all this, it is Shakahora. And I have been invited to talk to various clergy men and women, and we have gone through and thorough interrogation of the entire Shakahola staff. And my conclusion, and this is what I always say, in Shakahola, that is in Malindi, I think it's Kilifi County, that is a place where, if we can start from where Shakahola is, there is what you call Nyumbakumi. Nyumbakumi was a concept of a vigilante kind of a group that in every 10 households, there is our Zay there who knows what's happening in that small radius of 10 households. And it goes expanding like that. And so there were and this Nyumbakumi, they actually report to the sub-chief, who also reports to the chief, who also reports to the DCC, who also reports to the DC or the county, the CC, the county commissioner, and there is also the DCI, that's the Directorate of Criminal Investigation. There is also the NIS. There is no spot in this country that there is no ear of government in the name of NIS or NIS, DCI, and the chief and everybody. This country is overwhelmingly covered by information collectors. And within the shortest period of time, the government in Nairobi knows what is happening in Turkana in the twinkling of an eye, in real time. And so what I have been asking the many meetings that we have gone is that how did it happen that 400 people died and they were buried, and yet the government, which boasts of the best information collection in this part of the world, where was it? Now our conclusion is that the government in its failure is trying to look for an escape of that total and horrible failure at Shakahola. They are trying to shift that blame to the religious organization and more so the Christian denominations or the Christian church. And therefore it is very disheartening when we look holistically of what is happening in our country. 400 people died in Shakahola, and then the church is now being blamed. Last year during the Mandamano Azimio, I think of 161 Kenyans died from police brutality. During the Gen Z Mandamanos, I think about 60 something or 70 died. And also other Kenyans were thrown into the quarry. And all those are souls and lives of Kenyans that died so shamelessly and so shockingly. Yet this country is only focusing only on one area where Kenyans died through this mishandling of a religious church by Mackenzie, and then giving the government an opportunity to profile a whole sector called the religious sector. I think it is unacceptable. And this is what I've been saying, and this is my contribution to this, and I hope my friend and Council Kajama is listening. The Bible says, actually Jesus who said, kila mtu abebe msalaba yake. Let everybody carry his own cross. Why is the entire religious sector in this country being made to carry the cross of Mackenzie of Shakahola? Why are we being blamed? And why are we being profiled about how we worship and all this kind of stuff? Just because the government failed to arrest a situation where a wayward person committed those tragedies and those crimes. I also want to contact this, that if Bishop Stephen Dicho commits a crime, go for Stephen Dicho and apply the provisions of the Criminal Procedure Code or the Penal Code, apply it on Bishop Stephen Dicho and leave the others alone. If somebody commits a crime, go for him, because our set of laws are very clear on how every criminal should be arrested, charged in court, in a competent court of law, and even the court of law punish that person in jail or whatever other punishment. Why punish the whole entire sector because of the failure of one individual called Mackenzie? It is unacceptable. And we as the church, Charles Kajama Council, we are taking an action because we must stop this profiling. We are looking at the Constitution, Article 27 on discrimination. I think what is going on is discrimination against the Christian fraternity in this country from this government, either through that presidential, what do you call,
task force.
It is discrimination. We also feel that the name or the word religious organization is an omnibus to carry almost everybody, but the target is the Christians in this country, and more so the Pentecostal. And I would like to bring to your attention, Council Kajama, there's a whole world of difference between evangelical Christians or Evangelical Alliance of Kenya and the Pentecostal churches. Actually, the Pentecostal formation of the Christians is the largest single organization in this country, more than evangelicals, more than Presbyterians, more than Anglicans, and more than even the Muslims. It is those small churches you see in every small village, including those in Turkana, where these people are talking about not interfering with the elders. Those are Pentecostals. I read through the Attorney General's bill where it's talking of a commission that is going to be formed. In that commission, the evangelicals are there, the Presbyterians are there, the NCCK, the Catholic Conference of Bishops is there, the Anglicans, the Muslims, Hindus, but the Pentecostals have even been left out in that draft format, which is discrimination, it's unconstitutional. So what we are saying, Wakili Kajama, I would be very eager to see your proposed bill on this regulation. And I'm also saying the word regulation is a bit soft. What is intended in this country is to control the religious sector, to control the churches. And this is reminiscent of what happened in the communistic Russia or the former USSR, where religion was completely controlled and where even to be found with a Bible was a crime. If you're caught with the Bible during the USSR regime, it was just but to be hanged. People used to read their Bibles under their beds and under their blankets. Today, those countries that still oppose free gospel preaching, we thank God because of telephony technology. Because everywhere in this world today, you can download your Bible in your telephone and read it and get to know all the what's happening in the world. So, to cut my long story short, I am saying that Wakili Kajama, tell the president, he is your friend, and tell the government that this country feels, the church in this country feels intimidated. It feels it is being discriminated. It feels it's being profiled, and especially after this, after the religious sector and especially the church was used by the politicians to politic and get their votes. I saw an article in the Attorney General's bill, which says that if a pastor or a bishop allows a politician in his church to advance his political party manifesto or himself as a politician, I think the fine is 5 million shillings, or I think 3 years imprisonment, or both. And then we're asking, the president used that and he got the votes to be the president. Now he is bringing a law and we are interpreting it to mean that he does not want any other person to take advantage of the church where he took advantage so that nobody else will take that advantage and be elected. And therefore, I've gone through the whole of this bill. And the last point I want to point out to you, Wakiri, is on the issue of, I think it's Article 32, where it talks about every person have got a right. I was a member of parliament for 10 years, and I remember we operated under the old constitution. And I used to raise an issue then that we don't need what you call freedom of freedom of worship. I used to contend that worship is an inherent it's inherent upon, it's incumbent upon every human being to worship his creator. And therefore you don't need anybody to give you freedom. Because whosoever gives you freedom, whoever gives you freedom can deny you that freedom. And therefore we don't need that religious freedom. But what was put in the constitution is right to the freedom of worship, to the freedom of religion, because a right is a right and nobody can interfere with your right. And therefore, when also the constitution, Wakiri Kajama, talks about every person has got equal opportunity, either himself or with others, to worship, I think if you read that article, Wakiri, and I would like you to look at it critically, and I would like to read it for you. I think it's that 2 and there's sabbatical 2. Every person has the right, either individually or in the community of others, in public or in private, to manifest any religion or belief through worship, practice. I don't know whether I'm still on.
We can still hear you. You can land in a minute.
I'm finishing.
Kindly,
Practice, preaching, or observance include. Now, this is talking about people, persons, either individually alone or in community of others, to go somewhere, either in a public place or in a private place and worship. Now, if you can take a public place, it's like the church, what you are calling the church today. So where does legislation of this religion now come in? Actually, this article outrose registration of churches and religious organizations, because it's talking that every Kenyan has got a right, himself individually or in community with others, to go and worship. Where I'm not as an old lawyer like you are in practice, but I would like you to explain to us and Kenyans how Article 32 relates with the registration of churches when it is saying that every Kenyan individual or in community with others have got a right. I think, let me stop there. Next time I will join in and bring more, but I can tell you that we are going to court. We are going to court to stop the authorization of this Mungatana bill, because it has already been gazetted. I think it is ready for debate in the House, in the Senate, but we must also take some legal action against it, because it is draconian, punitive to the religious sector in this country, and we can't allow it. Thank you very much for listening to me. If my contribution submission was too long, I beg to be bear with me. Thank you very much, host.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you, Bishop, for your submission. Just before Senior Counsel gives his rejoinder, we'd like to note, yes, we for those who still have mics and have not asked their questions, we know we've run out of time. Usually we want to run from 7:30 to 9:30, but we extend when the discussion is robust and we can see that things are still yet to be mentioned. And we'll, of course, invite for a continuation of this discussion, because we can feel that there's many things that are yet to be covered well, or fully. So we'll request Senior Counsel to give his brief rejoinder, and then we will plan on how we will catch up in the next session and maybe continue on this if he's, of course, and I hope he'll be able to avail himself for the same. So, Senior Counsel, you can go ahead.
Before Senior Counsel talks, just 1 second, please. I would like to propose that we are supporting self-regulation. And actually, as a lawyer, I'm drafting what we call a charter on self-regulation for the religious sector. So what we want, Senior Counsel, leave the churches alone. We want to self-regulate ourselves. We don't want to be regulated by government. We don't want to be controlled by government. Actually, the question is that I would like to pose to you, who is controlling government? Who is regulating government?
Thank you.
All the tragedies are going on. Who is and why control and regulate church when atrocities are happening to the people of Kenya? Who is controlling those people? And they only come and control the religious.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you, Bishop. Yes, we can agree that part of the discussion, even next time, will be even that self-regulation. Part of the discussion can be what's the best solution for us to implement in that dimension, so that everybody is engaged. Because definitely we know there's a problem in the church. Maybe what people are definitely sure about is they don't feel maybe the government has the moral authority to be the one regulating it. But then we must say, okay, if the government doesn't do it, how shall we do it as a church for ourselves? Who shall be engaged? Shall it be, besides the leaders, shall it be the members? And how shall we do that? So, Senior Counsel, kindly proceed.
Okay, I think Honorable Ndicho has made several comments expressing the concerns of many people in the sector of the churches. He has talked about the Pentecostals and also about the importance of freedom of religion, which are very valid points. And in fact, the starting point in the discussion we've had today, or any discussion about the state and the church or regulation, is a point of freedom of religion in Article 32 of the Constitution. And I think Honorable Ndicho has brought out that issue very well. Bishop Ndicho. And he's also made reference, even though maybe not completely articulated Article 8 of the Constitution, that there shall be no state religion. So it's not the job of the state to prefer one religion to the other. He's also expressed the fear that the whole exercise that is going on is targeting Christian churches, even though it may not state so directly. So those are genuine concerns that are being expressed by people in the religious sector. There's also a concern about several initiatives targeting a religious sector or churches. And naturally, because of that concern, there is also confusion. And it's not easy to distinguish one proposal from another. So I think I have summarized my understanding of the concerns of Bishop Ndicho. And his last recommendation is, can we leave the churches to regulate themselves? When we went around the country, in fact, that was the most consistent feedback we got, that the religious leaders favor self-regulation, and they favor self-regulation through umbrella religious organizations. And I think the reason why they mentioned umbrella religious organizations is because there was an awareness, as has been mentioned by Redemptor here, who has made a comment about how she went to document from Malindi what had happened in Shakahola, that there's a recognition that if you have self-regulation at the level of your church or your religious organization, if you are Mackenzie, the Mackenzie will still happen because you'll be regulating yourself. There'll be nobody to control you. And I think when we went around the country, we found out that it is not only Mackenzie. There have been various other instances of religious extremism, including current ones that are in the making. So for us, I think it became clear that Mackenzie was just the one that had manifested in a dramatic way, but that if we did not come up with any recommendations, other Mackenzies were in the making. I think when you look at the task force report, it begins by making reference to various incidents of religious extremism in Kenya. And many of the ones we mentioned involved terrorism that was linked to Islamism, like at Garissa University, at Dusit Hotel in Nairobi, at Westgate, at the American Embassy. So I think there was a recognition. In fact, when we were at the coast, we found very useful feedback because we were in town hall meetings which had both Muslim and Christian religious leaders. Some of them were already collaborating in interfaith committees. And they told us that they recognize that religious extremism can arise from Islam, it can arise from Christianity, or indeed any other religion. And the reason extremism arises is not because of the religion by definition, but the human beings who interpret the religion in a particular way. So I think there was that recognition. And we also realized that religious extremism is not just a Kenyan phenomenon. We studied instances of religious extremism elsewhere and the responses that had been taken by people elsewhere. I think what was clear in most of the places we went to, that the religious leaders said we can no longer bury our heads in the sand. They were the ones who were most candid with us. And they said, we've seen some of our brothers and sisters misusing religion, both mainstream churches and the smaller, you could call them SME. No, SME is not a good word because it uses enterprise, but small and medium size churches. So I think, and not just churches and other religions, whether it is mosques and so on. So the truth is that we are beyond the stage where we can bury our heads in the sand. The truth is that we're in a situation where we need to assist each other. And the self-regulation, therefore, that was being recommended was the one that includes umbrella religious organizations. Because the key issue we're asking the people there is, how will self-regulation stop Mackenzie or reduce the chance of Mackenzie and the other Mackenzies that are happening around and about? And then the second thing I could say is that we were also concerned that Shakahola itself was the product of a series of failures, most of them government failures. And we were asking ourselves, if the government is the one that has failed, how do you reward a government that has failed in the Shakahola case by giving them more power to regulate religious organizations? How do you reward the one who has failed by giving them more power? And so we're very conscious that giving more power to government tends to result in bureaucracy and a gradual suffocation and suppression of fundamental right and freedom that is contemplated in the Constitution. But the Constitution also says that these rights and freedoms under Article 24 will be limited in an open and democratic society when necessary. This is what Article 24 says, and we also recognize and made reference to it when necessary to the extent that the limitation is reasonable and justifiable in an open and democratic society based on human dignity, equality, and freedom. And one of the criteria is to ensure that the enjoyment of rights and fundamental freedoms by an individual does not prejudice the rights and fundamental freedoms of others. So, for example, as we went around the country, many people told us, sometimes even as we really value the work of religious organizations, sometimes they might step beyond and violate the rights and fundamental freedoms of others. If, for example, you have planning laws, and at night in a residential area, you have a church that has put its speakers not inside the church, on the outside, at night during Kesha, and people cannot sleep. Is that not a violation of rights of others? This is right to a clean environment, to noise not to be beyond a certain threshold, and so on. So the truth is that we dealt with several cases where we found that sometimes there has been abuse of the freedom of religion, and it has not been easy to deal with the matter. And so we decided to come up with recommendations, and I hasten to add that it is very important to distinguish and separate Mungatana from Presidential Task Force, from what the AG did with the Gitu rules in 2014. Those are all very distinct attempts. The fact that some attempts did not involve stakeholders in the religious sector does not apply for the rest. I think one of the things that Honorable Ndichu mentioned is that there is a difference between Pentecostals and evangelicals. I know there are many evangelicals who consider themselves Pentecostal. There are many Pentecostals who consider themselves evangelical, and there is no settled agreement on whether Pentecostalism is part of evangelicalism or not. But the truth is that in terms of umbrella religious organizations, not every Christian who is evangelical or Pentecostal will belong to the same umbrella organization. And there are several. And in fact, we were given a list of the ones that are currently registered by the Registrar of Societies. And we received memoranda from from several other groups that were operating like umbrella organizations. They all give us their suggestions. And that is why you'll find in the recommendations of the Presidential Task Force that among the people who will be in the Presidential Task Force will be representative of Christian groups, because you cannot define all of them and say it is only 1, 2, and 3. So we had to come up with a kind of like a mechanism for determining how do you register an umbrella religious organization. How do you determine the number of members of this umbrella religious organization? So those are issues where there's a lot of dynamism in the country. So I think what I would like to insist is that it is not a good idea to bury our heads in the sand. Neither is it a good idea to look for solutions where a government just wields the power of regulation, even when government fails or descends into bureaucracy. But it's also good to realize that regulation is there in every sector. Today, we are not talking about future proposals. Churches and mosques as well are meant to comply with planning laws. They are meant to comply with the penal code. The leaders are expected to practice integrity. They are meant to comply with various other laws, property laws, and so on. So regulation is there. And currently, these religious organizations are regulated under the Societies Act. It is not true that there is no regulation. the regulation is there. In fact, some of the regulation that is there right now is quite inefficient. As I mentioned, for example, having to travel to Nairobi to file returns. So what we recommended in the Presidential Task Force is ultimately a model that you can call hybrid regulation. You will not go to any country in the world, in my view, based on the studies I have done, and found that religion is completely unregulated. Even the countries that have the greatest freedom of religion, and Kenya wants to be one such country, countries like United States that we studied in our benchmarking, they still have aspects of regulation, but the aspects may be based on whether you want to be registered to enjoy tax exemption, whether you want to enjoy certain privileges like the right to own property and so on. That is what invites you to take up registration, and then you get regulated. But if you want to remain unregistered, to be preaching on a Sunday at Arboretum, for example, then if you're in the United States, nobody will interfere with you. And even when we had discussions in the task force, I made that clear that, look, if people want to organize their religious activities without registering, why should you compel them to register? So those are some of the discussions that gave rise to the recommendations of the task force, which were an attempt to calibrate a proper balance between promoting and favoring freedom of religion, and also recognizing a bit of hybrid regulation. Hybrid regulation means a big dose of self-regulation and some sprinkling of government oversight through the Religious Affairs Commission, the Religious Affairs Disputes Tribunal. Right now, people do go to court when they disagree on religious matters. In fact, there are so many cases in court. That is an aspect of regulation, you would say, because the court intervenes and decides the disputes. You're fighting over property, you're fighting about who is the leader, you're fighting about whether to amend the constitution of the church that you set up. People are having injury has happened to people's life and health, and you can't be taken to court. So there is actually some regulation. The truth to the question, should the state regulate churches, is that today there is religious organizations, whether churches or mosques, are subject to varied regulations like any other entity in the society. But really, the real question is, should there be more regulation? And I think the general sentiment is, let's avoid increasing regulation unless we can show that that regulation contributes to efficiency and freedom of religion, and at the same time bringing out the conmen and the people who are abusing religion to cause harm. So I think that balance is what Honorable Ndichu is agonizing over. How do we get the right balance? And I think that is also what the Presidential Task Force was asking religious leaders and clergy from each of the 47 counties. Personally, I visited 1/3 of the counties. I heard from people who spoke the way Honorable Ndichu has spoken, and various others, and they had such rich ideas. And those ideas are the ones that have been captured in the Presidential Task Force. I think the biggest difference between the Presidential Task Force and the AG's guidelines, or maybe the ones of the Senate, is that religious leaders were present in the cooking of the Presidential Task Force. They were there in the discussions, not only by presenting memoranda, which happened for other reports, but also digesting the memoranda, discussing, reflecting, asking themselves, how do this impact our churches? And so I think the outcomes of the various reports should not be conflated. And for us, we really think that the Presidential Task Force report should be subjected to an implementation committee where there is even further public participation from those who have reviewed the report, like Honorable Ndichu, and then it's improved, and ultimately the administrative proposals implemented, the legislative ones presented to Parliament, and eventually the church will end up stronger than where it is today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For sure, we can tell that this conversation is not yet complete, and we would definitely need to continue on with it. But time will not allow. I would request for forgiveness for anyone with a mic who has not gotten a chance to speak. Because if we start asking questions now, of course, it will not be very conducive. But because we will be requesting senior counsel to come back and continue with the conversation, kindly come then and we'll give you priority on the mics. So I'd like to request my fellow co-host Jamhuri if he had any closing remarks, and then we will go to JN and we'll close with our anthem prayer. We know that Kenya is blessed. We have our national anthem is actually a prayer, and that will be how we'll conclude the session for today. We'll meet every Tuesday and every Friday, same time, 7:30 p.m. Kenya time. So, Mzalendo Jamhuri, any closing remarks?
Sure. Very quickly to thank Wakili Kanjama for your very, very, very balanced approach to all of this. I'm sure all of us have learned a lot. And also the invitation that you did to all of us to self-reflect that at the end of the day, each one of us may have their conscience and religious beliefs and believes them to be the correct ones, and wants to regulate others based on those religious beliefs. Nikiona mtu akinunua mchanga naona akiwa mjinga, kumbe yeye ananiona nikiwa mjinga nikitumia rosary, mwingine ananiona nikiwa mjinga nikienda kuombea sijui wapi. So the idea of and I'm only underscoring that for all of us to self-reflect that at the end of the day, that freedom of conscience and that agency to do what is meaningful to us religiously or in terms of conscience, is quite fundamental. And then very quickly, Senate inatengeneza bill. I've heard Honorable Ndisho talk about a consortium of church leaders heading to the court. And I also want to underscore what I inferred as a question from Redemptor. We're talking about 400 people killed. While all this back and forth is happening, who is working for the justice of those people? Because this is not theoretical. For anybody who has lost their lives, there's a family agonizing somewhere. And so, we know that there were failures, even as we are talking about regulation or lack thereof. Where is justice for those who were harmed? And it doesn't matter whether they were harmed through religion or otherwise, they were harmed, and they deserve justice. So even as we have this conversation, I hope that we don't lose sight of that. Sanche Wallace.
Thank you, Mzalendo.
Thank you, Wallace, for the excellent moderation. And thank you, Wakili Charles Kanjama, for really giving your time and being here the whole more than 3 hours. We really appreciate that. I really feel like we have taken a lot of your time and we had not prepared you about the extension. So you have been very gracious to us. We appreciate your time. And also, Bishop, we thank you for your comments. We thank you, Professor Kivutha, and everyone who has made their comments today. I feel, okay, at first I felt like there is a conflict between the work of the task force and what Bishop is proposing, but I almost feel like we could get to a middle ground. And what I feel from the sharing by Senior Counsel Charles Kanjama is that they considered a lot of factors and they did a thorough job. And I also feel they really have the good intentions. So I hope that there'll be a meeting of minds. I don't know much about the Mungatana bill, and maybe that is not what we were discussing today, but the task force report and what Bishop is recommending, there could be a middle ground. And I hope that we have more opportunity to discuss, because we also don't want to extend forever. We know we have kept you already. So we don't want to extend beyond this time. I hope that we have another chance to interrogate even further. I hope we can hear more from the bishop, what they are proposing, because there seems to be a group around that of clergymen. What are they proposing about self-regulation, and what is the way forward? How can we find a middle ground? So thank you very much. I really appreciate everyone who has been part of this conversation. I will be consulting our speaker and our co-hosts, so that we see if we continue with this conversation maybe next week. We could have the same topic, or maybe vary the topic. Maybe we could have other speakers. I have seen somebody recommending that we invite an imam. That's something we can also look at, because this is a very important conversation right now in this country. And it's good to strike when the iron is hot. So thank you so much. Mbarikiwe nyote. If you have a comment, a suggestion, I always request you to come to the inbox. I saw somebody asking for the task force report, another person asking for the bill. Please, if you share your contacts on the chat section, not chat or my inbox or inbox of the co-hosts, we will share those reports. So thank you very much. Back to you, Wallace, for the final. So I don't know, just before that, I don't know if our speaker has a final comment before we end. Mr. Kanjama.
Okay, so maybe I can make a final comment now that you've requested. I think I've spoken for long, and I'd like to thank everyone who has participated in this space. Those who've organized it, the hosts, the speakers, the listeners, those who've contributed with questions, with comments. I would like to encourage all of us to continue engaging on these matters. Read the task force report, send comments. Hopefully the implementation committee will be set up soon. And for those who would like to take further action, for example, against the Mungatana bill, like Bishop Dichu, go ahead, because definitely you cannot organize something for the church without the church, or in opposition to the interests of the church. And I'm hoping that as a result of the activity that has started, it was, yes, triggered by a crisis, that the church will be stronger, the religious sector will be stronger. And ultimately, the religious sector exists so that each of us, especially adults, formed, can seek and find the truth, can seek an encounter with God, a supernatural world. The policy document, the draft policy of the task force, has discussed and described some of these concepts associated with religion. And we have been built, we have been designed so that we can seek God and find Him. And by finding and engaging with God, we can learn better to engage with our fellow men and women. And hopefully, men and women of faith, people of religion, will be the light that has been lit and set on the table, or the city built on a hilltop that can illuminate all and be sources of good example. Even as we discuss religion from the corporate perspective, there is a call for each of us to examine and reflect on our own individual approach to religion, a personal relationship with God. It's how it impacts our personal behavior and our social engagement with others. And when we have men and women who champion true religion and faith, they will be able to drown evil in an abundance of good.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you
once
very much.
again, Senior Counsel. So once again, as we conclude, just to remind us that we have these sessions every Tuesday and Friday from 7:30 p.m. So please keep checking because we'll be announcing the next space and the topic. Wallace.
Kenya is the leadership.